I haven't done a podcast in a while now because I spent most of May and June traveling. I was back in the United States for most of those 2 months. I was born in the United States. It's home, but it's not. It's where I grew up, but it's the country I left in 2012 to pursue my PhD and other opportunities. After over 12 years of living and working in Europe, I'd have to say I'm increasingly preferring Europe. Things have changed in the US recently, I'm sure you've noticed. As a result, my relationship to the US over the years has changed from I prefer it here in Europe to I'm safer here in Europe to I'm really glad I'm not in the US anymore, which is kind of sad because that is where I grew up. It is where I formed a sense of who I am, but it's no longer home anymore. This is the longest I've spent in the US since I left in 2012. And unlike previous journeys home, this one had a whiff of peril starting at the border. I heard all the news stories about ICE stopping people from entering the US, and maybe being a US citizen and a white male, which put me on the positive side of the racial profiling matrix, allowed my easy entry into the US. I have been critical of the Project 2025 regime. I wrote the book, Why Trump, that is, well, selling the honest truth about Trump and what's behind his regime. But I guess I'm a nobody, and nobody really cared from the regime. I was below the radar, which was probably a good thing. But it was still a little eerie being in the US, knowing how much has changed, how much hostility there is now from the government to its own people. So, with all of that, I developed a certain sense of my relationship to the US and a lot of observations about what the US is and what it's become. And so I made it back to this home that is not home, this trepidatious trip to the US. And so here are some philosophical insights that I have to share. I got on a plane in Europe, and I love to travel. I'm not fond of airports and planes. And I hear many tales of bygone era where air travel was glamorous, and such a time is way bygone by now. The current era of air travel is dominated by our corporate overlords who herd us through paramilitary checkpoints and cram us into flying sardine cans. And how many of my readers are old enough to remember when airports aren't shopping malls? When I went over in May, I had heard the reports that are apparently true that travel to the US is weighed down because of the fear of being stopped at the border. And that truth really struck me as we waited in the Helsinki terminal for our connecting flight to Chicago. The nearby gates had huge jumbo jets and many passengers waiting to go to Tokyo, Osaka, Istanbul, Bangkok, Zhengzhou, but smaller planes and fewer passengers waiting to go to Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles. Our mid-size plane, the smallest I'd been on for a transatlantic flight, was half empty. When we landed in the US, where you are herded into one of the paramilitary checkpoints to get into the country, there were two lines: US citizens and everyone else. Our plane from Europe had only two non-US citizens. Border control was better than I worried it would be. They had me scan my passport, asked me if I was bringing in any fruits, vegetables, meat, or something else I forget, and that was that. My spouse received even less scrutiny. No demand to see my phone, no demand to see my social media, or anything else invasive. Our journey back to the US, mixing business and family, began where we used to live. It has been years since we were last in this city, which I will not name to protect the innocent. We'd been there only 3 days and were shocked by how empty it all looked and felt from the very beginning. It's still a lovely upscale area, but what a decade ago was a vibrant city teeming with people, stores, and restaurants, it had become a shadow of its former self. Few people on the streets, even in rush hour, sparsely populated restaurants, and a disturbingly high number of closed businesses and empty retail spaces. Is that what it's like everywhere in the US now? Some people tell me it is. I see that everything, everything in the US is now 20 to 50% more expensive than when we lived there over a decade ago. One example, I visited my favorite bakery in my old haunts, a fabulous family owned establishment virtually unchanged since the 1930s when it was founded. Unchanged, except that the pastries at said bakery that were $2 are now over $3. Not their fault, certainly. That's how the economy has gone over the decades. But it's interesting that Europe doesn't have anywhere near that level of inflation. Maybe 10%, but not 50%. I suppose that's Europe's evil socialism, in which corporations are actually held accountable and have to pay attention to the law. At our hotel, we had the chance to partake of current American television. Oh my goodness. The utter inanity of what now passes for entertainment in the US. America's most wanted, most fattest, most stupidest, most broiest, most redneckiest. Yeah, reality TV, which seems to be the majority fare on television these days. Oh, and they had wrestling, of course, too, and various other nonsense mock documentaries. There are sitcoms, too, which in the US seems to be mostly laughing at people being stupid. There are some documentaries, yes, that combine voyeurism, sensationalism, and exploitation, mostly with a mega slathering of manosphere pandering. Something about crocodiles and swamps and people living out in the middle of nowhere sort of stuff. But it's no wonder that Americans make such disastrous political decisions if their life is at all informed by their televisions. Not that I hadn't been aware of forces making America garbage again, that is what MAGA stands for, right? But to be back in the US fully immersed in it was unpleasantly surprising. Everyone we met was friendly, they were doing their best, but a decade ago saying we lived in Europe elicited curiosity. Now it has sparked in people a wistfulness and even a touch of envy. There are also now fewer people to be friendly with in the US. From the airports to the coffee houses, there are fewer employees serving you and more machines forcing you to serve yourself. American corporations love automation, and that seems to be accelerating at a horrific rate. Here's another weird observation about the United States: temperature. And I'm going to gripe about temperature now. I am averse to excessive heat. I am of Nordic stock, primarily genetically, and I find anything over 80 degrees Fahrenheit unpleasant. What I found also unpleasant is the American obsession with excessive air conditioning. Why American businesses have the air conditioning set to colder in summer than they set the heat in winter is a mystery that still eludes me. I suspect it is part of the Americans' love of excessive energy use. It's a general fixation with excess that seems to define the American character. Air conditioning to 70 degrees Fahrenheit is sufficient, but no, they need 65. Water is sufficient, but they need to add a ton of ice so that the water glass is more ice than water. A car is sufficient, but no, you need a SUV or a truck. Then people need a 3-car garage, a riding mower, the largest TV currently for sale, and on and on and on. Blind, zombie, excessive consumption for its own sake. That's the American nightmare. Saying America is half dead is poetic hyperbole, but it's not entirely wrong. People blame the current regime, but they forget that it was America that created that regime. I wrote a book about that. Please do look it up, Why Trump? And speaking of politics, which I am going to now, I want to talk about the difference between the kitchen table and the public sphere. While I was in the US, I saw a lot, talked with many people, and became more aware than ever of what really defines the United States. I looked for the real America in my weeks of travel. And what is the real America? I doubt anyone can say with absolute certainty. But two things about the US are definite facts. One is the US isn't as corrupt and nasty a country as many foreigners feel it is. And sorry, Americans, most of the world really don't have a very high opinion of you and your country. They really don't. And the second fact is that the US isn't as pure and free a country as many Americans feel it is. That's also very true, sorry to say. The real America is somewhere in between these two weird extremes. During my travel through the US, I've seen many subtle reminders that America is a society stratified by class. It thinks it isn't, but it is. Race and ethnicity is inextricably interwoven with class. Those in higher classes are willfully blind to the realities of class. Of course, pretending that the US is a class society of truth, justice, and merit. And of course, everyone else who isn't in that higher class is not fooled. Now, I'm not rich, never have been, probably never will be, but the reality of class hierarchy was particularly stark when one night, waiting for the 11:32 p.m. commuter train back to my hotel, one, my spouse and I were the only white people, and two, we were the only people not half asleep from working all day and night. That experience brought to mind the political cliché about kitchen table issues. Politicians and corporate media wonks love using the phrase kitchen table issues, probably because it mixes nebulous meaning and indirect condescension. The undertone of the phrase is that people who can't afford a home with a separate dining room huddle around their kitchen tables to discuss their worries about making ends meet. Kitchen table is shorthand for working class. It just seems less Marxist somehow. And politicians who aren't working class, which would be nearly all of them, use the term to pretend they care about the underclasses. They're implying that they're good on kitchen table issues, even though they have little to no such lived experience. It's typical of the US that when I wrote an article about this, I searched for a legal stock image for kitchen table. The photo repositories returned zero working class kitchens, no matter how much I looked, how many sites I looked at. There were only photos of palatial kitchens, the one you see only in magazines, where there's a kitchen island in addition to a formal dining room. And let's not pretend this is a classless society. There's another undertone attached to kitchen table issues. The phrase conjures up the norm of the traditional nuclear family. To huddle around the small table and discuss kitchen table issues is to draw inward, secluded from the world, huddled around our little table. The struggle to make ends meet is a struggle against the world. Now, a brief ironic aside, it is interesting that the procedural phrase to table a motion, we're talking about the legislative world here, that means something different in the US from the rest of the world. In the US, to table a motion means to stop considering a legislative bill. In every other nation, it means to begin consideration of a legislative bill. So in the US, small isolated tables end discussion. In the rest of the world, longer open tables grow discussions. It's certainly not true that all working class families are detached or even antagonistic toward the world. But the kitchen table cliché speaks to a systemic problem in the US. It is a land in which the private sphere is at odds with the public sphere. So what do I mean by the public sphere? Well, there are important issues that people need to discuss. Some issues are personal and are best discussed in private. But the connotation that kitchen table issues are shared by all Americans should mean that they are discussed in public. They shouldn't be kitchen table issues. They should be public sphere issues. Philosopher Jürgen Habermas wrote about the importance of the public sphere as a space where individuals join together to discuss issues and what they want to do about them. In an open public sphere, people can freely express their opinions and their suggestions for solutions and political actions. Habermas argued that a vibrant public sphere had been the source of positive social and political progress throughout history, and that ensuring a vibrant public sphere is essential for continued progress. Without free and open communications in the public sphere, society degrades. And I agree with his observations. I can certainly observe that America is lousy at that public sphere thing. Not that any society is great at it, but the American hypocrisy on this is particularly glaring. For over a century, American individuals who have joined together to publicly discuss issues and what they want to do about them have been labeled subversives or communists or worse and repressed. Unless, that is, you were joining together to publicly discuss how to repress the working classes and anyone daring to talk about the need for social justice. Everyone else, go back to your kitchen tables and talk privately amongst yourselves. A classic example of this hypocrisy is an organization in America that calls itself the Public Square. It says it promotes communication and liberty, yet they are creepily obsessed with stopping women's productive freedoms. Indeed, half of the publications on the Public Square's website is about how we need to stop women from having health care. They also are very big on stopping wokeism and promoting the originalist view of the U.S. Constitution when only rich white males could participate in the public sphere. Oh, and they make some rather ominous hints that blue states should be removed from the U.S. and stuff about a coming civil war. And the public square's right-wing public square is not a public sphere, but a tool for resegregation. The U.S. could have a public sphere in which citizenship means something tangible, specifically participation in government. But that would mean challenging the lie that the U.S. is a classless society. It means admitting the history of discrimination and segregation in the U.S. It would mean reforming the electoral and political system. It would mean promoting the one thing that actually made America great, at least in theory, the idea of liberty and justice for all, not just for a few. That would be difficult, worth it, but difficult to accomplish this real public sphere. Too many Americans lack the courage, and too many forces have the money and power to prevent it. The message from the corporate media and the politicians is go back to your kitchen tables, talk privately amongst themselves, we'll tell you who to vote for in 2 years. So, America remains, and even digs ever deeper into, a segregated society. To be aware of this reality means you are woke, and that's why the right wing is so frightened of awareness. The right wing says government by consent. The public square, for example, just loves this idea, government by consent. But without everyone being included in a vibrant public sphere, the praise of consent is a farce. Pay no attention to the project behind the curtain, just go back to your kitchen tables. I really don't like being so negative. I really don't. But I am aware, and being away from the United States for all these years, I can see its realities more clearly than when I was immersed in it. I prefer to be hopeful that someday, sometime soon, Americans will get up from their kitchen tables and join together to build a vibrant public sphere. Not corporate media, not social media, but real people having real conversations to build real solutions. Suburbia. It's not like no country in the world doesn't have some form of suburbs, but it was kind of America more than any other country in the world that created the pseudo-reality of suburbia. And I had to spend several weeks in my trip in the United States at a hotel in suburban hell. Sorry, just a suburb. And here are my observations about that. And yes, I still have a very bad taste in my mouth. When Goddess created the human species, she gifted to us 2 legs and the ability to use them to walk upright for long distances. This ability and the use of opposable thumbs has allowed our species to do many things. Millennia later, most civilized people have deprecated their use of legs to stumbling between the kitchen and the TV room. Goddess should have given the gift of long distance walking to bears. Yes, the bears would have only gathered more nuts and berries, but the environmental destruction would have been much less. Regardless, in recent years, some good and clever people remembered that humans do have legs and came up with the goal of the 15-minute city. The idea is to design and zone communities so that most residents can, within 15 minutes, walk to work, walk to stores, walk to restaurants, walk to parks, and walk to most everything else they might want or need, all within 15 minutes. Brilliant idea. Look it up, 15-minute city. It's a revival of how cities used to be before the takeover of automobile culture and the idea that legs are best used to push gas and brake pedals. I was reminded about the 15-minute city concept one evening as I attempted to walk from my suburban hotel. I was able to get where I was going without being run over by a motorized vehicle, which is always a win in my book. At least this suburb's planners had remembered and implemented the marvelous inventions of sidewalks and crosswalks. I have spent time in the majority of the U.S.'s 48 contiguous states, and outside of the concrete jungles of downtowns, anything friendly to pedestrians is largely lacking. Pretty much anything built in America after about 1950s is a homage to the car, often merging with hostility towards leg users. America, especially in the suburbs, is not friendly to people who still use legs. The American assumption of automobile supremacy has a massive influence on American life. The American identity is almost synonymous with car ownership. Growing up embedded in those cultural norms, I stayed in my expected lane. I got my driver's license the first day I was eligible and owned my first car as soon as I could afford one. Reaching young adulthood in suburbia, yes, I grew up in suburbia, there was no better option. If you couldn't afford a car, your life opportunities were severely limited. I enjoyed driving when it was a free choice. Commuting to work? Ick. Driving cross country through fields and woods? Bliss. Sheer bliss. I did love the last car I owned. I put 134,000 miles on it before selling it when I moved to Europe in 2012. I thought then that I would miss driving far more than I actually have. For 12, 13 years, almost 13 years now, I've been, more often than not, happy not having the burden of a car. But then, I don't live or work in suburbia anymore. I live in Europe in a 15-minute city, in which my opportunities are not much limited, and the need for a car is no longer real, if it ever really was. But let's talk about American suburbs. Let's talk about a great philosophical question. What is real? And what is a simulacrum? A simulacrum is something that replaces what is real with its representation. What is real and what is a simulacrum? These are questions important not just for philosophers, but for all of us. I wrote this down originally as notes. And as I was writing this, I was looking through the window and I saw a U.S. flag fluttering in the breeze. The U.S. flag is a simulacrum. It's a real object, but it is a representation of the U.S. It is not the U.S. Hugging the flag doesn't mean you actually love America. Embracing all Americans is actually loving America. That's the difference between a simulacrum and reality. Symbol versus reality. Now, I will go on a limb here and state that suburbia is more representation than reality. The American dream. What is that? It's more of an illusory trap than a real dream. There was a comment once made by Ellen Goodman, and I quote, "Normal is getting dressed in clothes that you buy for work and driving through traffic in a car that you are still paying for in order to get to the job you need to pay for the clothes and the car and the house you leave vacant all day so you can afford to live in it. That's normal." Is that too harsh? Maybe, but it's not entirely off base. The point is that the number of people who believe that the numerous accoutrements of suburban life will make them happy far outnumber those who are actually made happy by suburban life. If you aren't already happy in yourself, having the house, having the lawn, and having the many tools to tend to the house and lawn, and the automobiles, and the huge garage to put it all in ad nauseum, will never make you happy. Don't believe the commercials. They're all simulacra, not real life. I started to realize the lie of the suburban American dream while suffering through my big, ugly suburban high school. The school trained people to want the simulacra of white, lower middle class accoutrements, the lower middle class suburban life. It wasn't open to people having any other oppositions because what else could anyone want? You want the house, the lawn, the riding mower, the everything else. I wanted reality then, and I still do. In high school, I was the misfit who was interested in books and ideas and trying to figure out things. I sought meaning and purpose beyond get job, get married, get house, get kids, and keep your damn lawn mowed. USA should really stand for the unoriginal simulacra of America. And I'm reminded of a day years ago in the US when I was in a car, and my spouse, who was driving that trip, had stopped at a red light. As we waited, we looked to the right at a house. Every inch of the landscaping of said house was manicured to an extreme degree. Bushes and a hedge were pruned to within a hair of their lives. The grass was cut like a putting green, and the lawn along the driveway and curb had been edged so severely that every blade of grass was exactly the same distance from the concrete. My spouse quipped that the inside probably has one of those living rooms with the plastic over the furniture that no one ever sits in. And how much work was it to make the yard look like that? I chuckled and said, "Artificial enough to show they care." Ever since then, my epiphanic quip has, for me, defined much of American life, mostly, but not only, suburbia. Artificial enough to show they care. People show it in their yards, their houses, their cars, their clothes, their grooming, their actions. Artificial. Simulacra. Real? Natural? Relax. You're doing it wrong. English country garden? Too wild and free. You must have severely shaved lawns and mutilated shrubs, preferably monotone ones. Make sure your house exterior, driveway, and patio look like everyone else's. Be sure to install a massive central air conditioning unit and crank it up so all summer you can go from frigid house to frigid car to frigid office or store. And don't get me started on the monoculture of bleach blonde women and light beer commercial men. In suburban America, you can be anything you want as long as it is normal. As long as you show in your every word and action that you are artificial enough to show you care. As I sat in the lobby of my suburban hotel writing down these notes, I noticed that it was 63 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but the air conditioning was on. Not a single window in the place isn't sealed to prevent any fresh air from entering. And to my mind, that's an allegory for America. Not only is America artificial, but is actively resistant to reality, not letting in any metaphorical or actual fresh air. From buildings to news channels to government, there is a giant air-conditioned warehousing of American life. Seal yourself off from the real world. Consume only what you are told to. Act only how normal Americans are supposed to act. Fear and loathe anyone who is different and steps out of line to being real and natural. This is America. And for me, it's not home.